everybody. Welcome to Women's History Month, the month of March, and we are presenting to you Laying the Foundation for Women's Wellbeing, a LISC panel discussion. And I have the pleasure of chatting with three phenomenal women who are rock stars in their own respectives. We are just so grateful that they are here today to talk to us. And we're going to have a really candid and great off-the-cuff conversation. It's not scripted. So, whenever our panelists feel like jumping in, jump in. And, I think those are the best kind of conversations where the world can learn so much from you ladies. So what I will do, by the way, I'm Holly Long. Hi, everybody again. Thank you for joining us. I am the development officer for LISC Greater Kansas City, and I have the pleasure of sitting in our nice new office, our new, well, I don't say new, but like we have a new computer system. So in the event that something happens, excuse me, because I'm not a techno person at all. So another thing I want to do is give a couple of shout outs before we get started to our national comms team, Saba and Denise, and our local comms guru, Abigail, for everything you all have done behind the scenes to get this thing going. So no further ado, let's get this panel going. All right. Well, we have some heavy hitters, y'all. And first, I'll start with Lisa Kasagawa, who is a board member of LISC. And she's also the regional vice president of NeighborWorks America. Lisa, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so glad you are here. I enjoyed our pre-production call yesterday. And next we have Nicole Barcliff, who is the Senior Policy Director, I think that is correct, for LISC National, and she has headed up our childcare policy as well as other policies. She's located in DC, of course, the seat of the capital, so why not, So Nicole, welcome to our conversation. It is a pleasure to see you again, and I always like creating space with you, so welcome, welcome, welcome. And last but not least, we have Denise St. Omar, who represents the Greater Kansas City Community Foundation. KC people, yep. Denise is a phenomenal person, a great advocate for the BIPOC community. She leads racial equity training for AFI. She does it all. She is truly has her ear to the streets and as far as Kansas City community as well as the nation. So we welcome you, Denise. And let's get started. So, Women's History Month, y'all. What do y'all first think about when you hear it's Women's History Month? And in your respective locations, like what you actually do. And feel free to jump, whoever wants to start.
Sure. It's great to be here.
We all are off of mute, so we can actually have a conversation,
Sure. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me. I think for Women's History Month, sometimes I don't like these like months, API Heritage Month and, et cetera. But I do think that it is because it should be Women's History Year all the time. But I really think about, in the housing community economic development field, we don't always see the analysis, right, about impacts and disparities facing women. We don't have a lot of programming that's specifically targeted to women. I think that there's bits and pieces over the years that I have seen, but oftentimes it's an afterthought. And so I think that I always take a moment to really think about, how we can really be integrating a gender analysis into all of the work that we do as housing community development practitioners.
I completely agree with Lisa, and through a policy lens, I think of Women's History Month and I think of it as a prime opportunity while people are paying extra attention
Yeah.
to highlight the overall impact and influence and importance of women's contributions to society, and particularly through the lens of policy that I'm focused on intently these days for childcare, how integral the role of women is in caregiving writ large, but especially in stabilizing local communities and providing economic stability through actually being care providers and running childcare businesses and micro enterprises, but also being, mothers and grandmothers and extended givers, and what that means in terms of how public systems can better support that backbone of support that women provide.
And I'm also going to agree with this, this idea of months. I think I struggle with because I think it gives people, it could give people an excuse to not think about us for the other 11 months of the year. But I think, when I think about it, I think what's interesting is, so I work in philanthropy, and as a sector, and, my office as a sector, a lot of times, it's women that are working within philanthropy. But what's really interesting is that when in my role, I often am asked to represent the Community Foundation in other spaces, task force groups that are doing and having these conversations around policy issues that deeply impact women, and particularly women of color. And then when you're in those spaces, so those civic leaders, those decision makers, oftentimes that's when we find that we are not the majority in the room at the table where the policy decisions are being made that deeply impact the ability of women to thrive.
Mm-hmm. So what I want to leave out of here with, and I want our audience to understand, each of us in our respective locations are breaking down systemic obstacles to building equitable and inclusive communities, right? And, I want to highlight why we are in the spaces that we're in and the challenges that we have to go through in order to represent and further push the agenda. I think there's a theme amongst, when I was doing my individual production calls with you all, there's a common theme of equity that reigns through each one of your works. And it's crazy. And so with that being said, we talked a lot about, childcare. We've talked about health. We'll talk about housing. And so how those are all intersected together, but at the underlying end, and Denise, I think you said this the best in our pre-production call, we need to address the root causes of disparities versus like putting Band-Aids. And so, I open the floor up to either one of you who wants to start, like, where are you at in this Women's History Month and in your search for equity, personally, professionally? What drives you to continue to push the envelope and where you're going, and what is your motivation?
I'll start with that, Holly. I think, I always share with this work is deeply personal for me because it's about my family. And it's about, I myself don't have kids, but I am like and I think I can say it on a recording, I'm the favorite auntie to my nephews. And so it's the concerns that we have on their daily survival, and particularly what we've seen in terms of just their safety as young Black men, being able to navigate this world. And so I think that we all do this work because it's deeply personal. I think for me, what's really interesting, and I mentioned to you, Holly, here at the Community Foundation, we're working on a project that's really deeply grounded in community to really try to address that issue that the people that are making the decisions for us don't have the lived experience to really be able to understand the issues. And so as part of that, we spent the weekend doing some focus groups. And I was really deeply moved, particularly, I think, as we talk about Women's History Month, particularly as I listened to the women that were in the group that shared deeply personal experiences they were having. And I think where I sit with is we have policies that are designed in theory to help women survive, but are barriers to their ability to thrive. So, we had several women that were talking about young women, single mothers, small kids that had significant and serious health conditions. First in their families to attend college, came from, some of the most under-resourced areas in our country, but really were not able to thrive professionally because they had to be so conscious of how much money they made that would take them out of the ability to be able to access the federal supports for the medications. So they're in this catch-22 where they're having to make decisions about being able to stay alive and take care of their kids. And so I think that brings me, so I've been, ever since having the privilege of being in the room with these women, I've been thinking about, about these policies that are being made that deeply impact the lives of women, and particularly BIPOC women, that are being made in rooms by people that not only don't come from that background, but are predominantly men. And that is, so when we talk about systemic barriers, there we go.
And that's funny you should say, because Nicole, kind of piggybacking off of what you and I talked about, why you even are in community development, and particularly in policy, you said, why not be able to influence the opportunities to get more opportunities or greater opportunities? But you said it better than I could, so go ahead.
No, I think this is such a dynamic and good conversation to have, because it gets to the point of kind of why are we here? Why are we doing this work? And why is it important to highlight and empower traditionally marginalized and maligned populations that are insanely influential and consequential to local communities and thriving? So if we think about our communities holistically, you can't think about a community thriving in a holistic manner without thinking about the role of women. And if we hone in, women play multiple roles and significant and deep roles in local communities. But if I hone in just on caregiving, we know that 66% of caregivers are women. And that's just talking about caregivers of adults and children with special needs. If you hone in on childcare specifically, you know that 95.6% of all childcare businesses are owned by women, and more than half of those are BIPOC. So you have, in the context of local communities, this huge important subset of a population, a majority of populations in some communities, if you really think about it, who are providing an invaluable support, but somehow are blocked from accessing significant public sector supports for what they're doing. So we all talk about the role of women in being equitably compensated and having work valued and having the role in family valued. Our goal at LISC, and my goal in this position, is to look at the streams that are existing and the programs that are there, and are they making sense for and supporting the backbone of local communities, which are predominantly women in the caregiving sense, and then more than half in terms of women of color. And so what we know is that if we're trying to create these thriving communities of opportunity, you can't do that without looking at the crux of what women provide in terms of workforce supports and economic supports for folks if you want to attach to a job that is outside your home or even inside of your home. The pandemic taught us you need childcare, and if you want to improve outcomes for kids, you need quality childcare. You want safe spaces and thriving spaces. You want economic support for people who want to be business owners and look at childcare not only as a public service and an offering of love to their communities, but also as a viable economic means to provide a valuable service to local communities. So I think that Women's History Month in particular, although I agree with all the other presenters that shouldn't just be 1 month, it does provide the opportunity to say, like, let's value the true contribution of women and make sure that public sector supports and private dollars as well truly support what it takes to create a thriving community of opportunity. I don't see how you do that without investing in women.
I'll just take us back to systemic issues, and as you know, Denise said, it's very personal. I think I started my work in community development with a public health background. And so I think that, you know, public health, I think the lens of public health looks at physical, they talk about such social determinants of health, really acknowledging the fact that oftentimes it's where people live as opposed to, you know, access to medical care. And the analysis, I think, around disparities, I think very much has shaped sort of the way I see the world. I'm a grandchild of, you know, my grandmother was a garment worker. My mother, she gave birth to my mother, you know, at a horse race track. My mother's birth certificate has a horse stall number on it because they were displaced during World War II. And 2 days after she gave birth, they put her on a train to be incarcerated in one of the two incarceration camps for Japanese Americans in the South. And so they were in Arkansas. And so I think that, and then subsequently were deported. And this is, you know, it's absolutely about the story of women, right? And their the choices that they've made and actions of the state have caused challenges in their lives. And so I feel like while it's been a challenging history of the women in my family, it's also given me the ability to bridge with immigrant communities, understanding the story of deportation, linking up with the impacts of incarceration in Black and Brown communities. And I think that the lived experience of our families and the multi-generational histories that we bring with us, I think really gives us a different way to think about and know from a very real perspective, the systemic challenges that have directly impacted the lives of, you know, women in our families and our communities. So I feel like when you're thinking about, there's so many different systemic issues when you think about housing community development, whether it was redlining, whether it's been displacement, whether it's transportation, you know, transportation projects that have decimated communities, right, of color in particular. I just feel like there's so much of that. I am not in a policy advocacy role anymore, but you know, when I was at national capacity in DC, Nicole, I wish I was there now because there were just so few women of color who were doing the policy and advocacy work in housing and community development. And it was, I was sharing with Holly that I was often, you know, I started at national capacity as a brand new executive director. I think everybody thought I was in my 20s, but I was not. You know, oftentimes I was the only woman, only person of color, and youngest person in the room, and in a lot of the policy conversations and the coalition meetings. And it was difficult, but I quickly got over feeling like I didn't know, or that I shouldn't, you know, that I should let people with more experience sort of speak first, et cetera, because, you know, I just felt like that burden of carrying so many voices and communities and experiences and perspectives. I feel like women of color, that's a common experience, and we just have to be loud with our voices.
I think you're absolutely right, Lisa. And one of the interesting things is that when you enter those spaces, just to hone in on that last part that you said,
Yeah.
there is, I call it an honor. It's a responsibility though, but you do feel like you're representing your
Yep.
communities. And it's meaningful in a way to channel that very personal connection to local community, to have it elevate in a way on a national stage or on a state stage or on a city stage to help direct and influence resources. And so, and resources, not just resources, we know that there's also structures at play that have very little to do with money, but they do influence quality of life. But one of the empowering things about being a woman who stands on the shoulders of so many women before us is that we've earned the right to be here. We can own and take up this space, and we do have something meaningful to say and contribute that is unique and authentic. And so it's just opportunities like this are like a sweet spot to be surrounded by colleagues who are coming to this work from a very similar perspective. It feels safe and like home. But you're right, the majority of the time our situations don't feel that way, and we are tasked, quite honestly, with representing the needs and communities, and in order to do them justice.
So
Talking
what would
about
you say?
wellness, I just want to build on that because I also want to name that there's a toll that there's a toll. It's an honor, but I often as well it's gotten a little bit better, but I am often the only woman of color. Have often been. And you know, and a lot of times because you're in those spaces, you really it takes an additional layer and amount of energy, self-control, of not like I'm about to lose it on somebody. That means that we are often putting ourselves in spaces where we know we're going to be disrespected or dismissed. And so what I want to do is I want to acknowledge that. And I want us to make sure that we're all centering well-being, that we're taking, that we acknowledge that for this work in so many spaces is led by women. Oftentimes it's women not at the head of an organization, it's women in the middle of their organization, it's women in those spaces. And so we have to make sure that we're centering our well-being in this work as well, and that we're taking care of ourselves, and that we're acknowledging that sometimes we need to rest, and every once in a while you might need to tap out for just a little bit and be like, oh, child, I need to let me take some time off, let me take a nap, let me get some meditation in. But I want to make sure that I think that's part of the challenge. It is, I think women, we are acculturated to be the caretaker, and to focus on taking care of everyone else, and sometimes at the expense of ourselves. So I just want to put that out there, that the struggle is real. And so we all need to make sure that we're centering our well-being as well.
And what would you say to our fellow sisters who are out there in this struggle, where they are in a room, maybe they don't have the luxury of meeting the three of you, or seeing, like we said, being the only person of color, and only woman of color in their space? What would you say to them to encourage them to keep going? And does it get better at the end of the tunnel? Like,
Here's what I would say for me is really what's been really helpful for me when I first started doing the racial equity work within my own institution. It felt very isolating, kind of a little lonely. And so I really worked at developing my tribe.
Exactly.
And that is the group that lifts me up when I'm feeling down, that talks me off the ledge when I'm about to jump and do something that might get me fired. And so I think that's really, for me, that's been something that's really important for me. And then I do think that the last 3 years for me, I have not always been good at centering my own well-being. So really very consciously, adopting some of the practices. I have morning meditation every morning, my journaling, and when things get really stressful or busy for me, those sometimes are the first things that I let drop off, and I always pay the price. So I really just center those practices.
Ditto. I had those same words. Find your tribe. Find the women, the people who will support you, that you can lean on. I think we all need it. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a number of women of color in community development, and we were dreaming about how we could come together in person after the pandemic. And that's just a reminder. I haven't found a way to do that. So we need to do that. It's just hard because the fact that we have to take an extra effort, right, to create those spaces for ourselves, to create those networks for ourselves. They are not sort of pre-existent in a lot of the places that we're at. So I think that, for those of you who feel like you don't have your tribe, create an opportunity for that network to evolve, to get, take a step and lead from whatever seat you're in, to be able to create it for yourself and for others, for sure.
Absolutely. This conversation reminds me of another stat that I heard that is, although men provide assistance, women caregivers spend as much as 50% more time providing care for community, for children, for families than their male counterparts by social design or a construct, or however folks want to weigh that out. So in that context, this is outside of our professional lives wholly. This is writ large. As a holistic human being, you're drawn from different angles. I think that find your tribe is absolutely a good instruction. But the other piece that I'm learning kind of mid-stride is that sometimes you have to say no, and saying no is good for your own preservation, but also oftentimes for the quality of whatever the end product is that you're working on. Like, knowing capacity doesn't make you weaker. It doesn't mean you're less effective. It actually makes you probably more valuable and a more balanced person. And so I think pandemic recovery periods have really, I think we had a lot of forced reflection during the past 3 years. And that is something that I walked away from, aside from, of course, these strong networks that, of like-minded individuals, and then people who will challenge you to think critically about your contribution to yourself, your well-being, and to society. But learning how to say no in a way that's respectful and meaningful. And it might be no, and I'm going to point you in this direction towards something else that might be helpful. So therefore you still feel like you're being useful, if that's the pathway. That has been a key finding for me.
I want to kind of shift back into policy, right? You three ladies are powerhouses in your own right. And we all know it can get kind of tricky. and with that policy, does it seem that some policies, if not most policies, were created to keep this cycle of poverty, of just barely getting by, okay, I gotta take care of my mom, my dad, but this, I gotta go to this job, I gotta go here, I gotta do, it is overwhelming to see and to feel the weight that women carry in this world. And let alone when it comes to policies that were not created for them, whether that was how to deal with their own bodies, whether that is equal pay, things of that nature. What do you say to our sisters who are listening, who may feel like, okay, what is the best way to advocate for myself, even though I'm not in the space of an advocate per se, or what is the best course, or what can I do as just a little person? If that makes sense.
I think that's a loaded question. And so I'll take a sliver of it, because I'm quite sure that there's a range of things that are not just this. What I've found in my limited time doing federal policy work is that most things and ideas and advocacy points are not new. So you don't always have to recreate the wheel. You may have a fresh perspective or take or approach, but you can likely try to influence an existing community that has voice and see whether or not you can influence that agenda. Because I think sometimes people never get started because it feels so overwhelming because you feel underrepresented and it's just like it feels hopeless. So I don't think that's the case. So for folks who are not engaged at all, look to your left, look to your right. Like times out of 10, particularly in this field, there's someone who may be talking that talk and not exactly the messaging that you have, but you may not have to recreate from scratch a new agenda. And so in terms of how can you be helpful, to your first assertion about systems, I think that one of the pleasures of working at LISC was this recognition and a public recognition, particularly in the past few years, that we recognize that public systems were, for the most part, started from a base of inequity. So if you just start with that recognition, you do less accusing of the who, the why, but more an acknowledgement of the systems are inequitable. And there are certain groups, in particular, BIPOC people, women of color, women, who inevitably, because how systems began, lose out on programs, on funding, on practice, just because of structures. And so I think that aligning and finding yourself in a place that shares that value, I think is something, it loops back to this well-being piece for policy work or advocacy work, is that if you're at the wrong place that can't agree on that core value, that's going to be draining for you. And it doesn't mean you have to jump ship and abandon, but I found it helpful over time to try to situate myself with places and opportunities that have the core value, or they're trying to get there. They may not be all the way there, but they're trying. So I think that on that end, I'll stop there because there's so much more to say, but like there's a long way I think we all have to go, but at the very least, to be situated in a place where you like, you know what, we all recognize that there's an issue and something that we can work towards to improve, and how we get there is the piece that you get to have fun with, quote unquote, and grapple with.
So I'm going to take off my community foundation hat for a minute so I can be a little bit more radical. So one of the things that I do is I serve on the board for a local fund here called the Hadley Project. And the Hadley Project is focused on racial justice, social justice. And so what I will say is that, and we have been funders of local organizing movements, particularly KC tenants, which is grassroots organizing focused around impacting local policy around affordable housing. And they have been incredibly effective in being able to use acts of civil disobedience and being disruptive when they need to really influence and shape local policy. So I give that as an example because, for one, philanthropy needs to support grassroots organizing, movement building, and building community leaders that are doing that work more than we do. Point blank, end of story. And I get to do that through the Hadley Project. But I think that's the piece that where I see is the power of people that aren't part of an organization. Like, there's kind of standard things that we'll say to that which is like, well, go out and vote. You need to register to vote. All those things are important. But if there is there are movements, there are groups that are organizing to influence policy, a lot of times at the local level, but often at the state and national level. And so I think that those organizations are much more, can be as impactful at shifting and impacting policies that deeply affect women and women of color. And so what I would really say is to people is if there's if there's a group where you're at that's doing that level of organizing or movement building, then get involved. If there's not, then start one.
Yeah. Makes me think of Moms Rising. It makes me think of, the group that I helped found when I was a young person. It still exists today, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. There used to be an organization called Macaulay Institute, which actually was doing a lot of work at the intersection of women and community economic development and housing that no longer exists. And there was no organization to sort of take its place. So I think, if and then each of our organizations, a lot of the intermediaries like LISC, NeighborWorks, we need to really, I think, figure out how to make it more of an integral core part of all of our analysis in terms of selecting priorities, in terms of how we drive our resources, et cetera. But absolutely, to Denise, I mean, the origins of community development was organizing. And, there's a whole new movement of organizers and social change activists that I think we are not connected to as much as we should be as a housing and community development field. So that is certainly something that I've been trying to figure out how to support and really lift up a lot more, because actually there's been a lot of tension between organizing groups and CDCs that have evolved to become much more present as real estate developers as opposed to organizers, right? And so some of that history, I think, needs to be reshared and reconnected to.
So where do we go from here? What is the future look like in the next 10 years? We can be as optimistic as we want. That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question, be as pessimistic as you want, as realistic as So I'm asking two things. In your perfect world, what does the future look like? And then with the world that we have now, what does the future look like? And then how can we marry those two, if it's even possible? I know it's kind of makes you think.
You want us to solve the world's problems?
Well, we're women, that's what they expect us to do, right?
I mean, I really do think that there would be great value for a more formal resourced group of women in housing and community development, women of color in housing and community development, to really be a mirror to some of our longstanding institutions and organizations, foundations, to really set a different policy agenda that centers women of color. What would that look like? I haven't been in a place or a space where we've been able to really think about that as the center of why we're coming together. So that would be something for the future.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Holly. So when I was in undergraduate, I was getting a minor in Black Studies, and I remember having this conversation with my mom, talking about, particularly at the time, right around when we were studying the Freedom Rides. And I remember saying to my mom back then, I don't know if I would have had the courage to do that. And I remember thinking, and the conversation continuing into, and I'm never going to have to, I'll never know. And then I think the world we live in, that was the optimistic thought of my youth. And so I think as we, so we're seeing like this, we're seeing the same similar system, kind of post-Reconstruction systems of really weaponizing laws in race-neutral ways that are deeply designed to impact and disenfranchise not just Black and Brown people, but immigrants, different religious groups. Like, we're seeing the weaponization and this and the use of policies to kind of put us back in our place.
Absolutely.
And that is really, so from that perspective, sometimes it's hard for me. So when you ask me what the world, like the future, vision for the future, you know, depending on the day you catch me in on, you know, it's going to differ. But what I will say is that what I think that the space where it left me at is that I do, and I need to have the courage to step into ways that feel that feel uncomfortable, that might feel professionally risky, because I need this. I need the world not to continue to move backward. I need this country not to continue to move into a place where it's not safe. There's not this opportunity, all of those things for the next generation. So, so I think from my perspective, I think it's part of what shapes why I do what I do within philanthropy. Locally, but also nationally. So funders have this tendency to try to program our way out of inequities and racial disparities. You know, we all acknowledge there's a child care crisis going into the pandemic. It's even worse going out. Philanthropy wants to just say like, oh, well, you know, there's a couple of you know, great centers I can make a grant to. Well, but what we need, those centers are financially fragile because of the policies, because of the ways that we reimburse and support and care for all of those things. So I think that's why I do what I do, because what we need to do is making that grant to the center is really important. Those supporting nonprofits that are addressing the needs of our, you know, children and families and our women are important. But we have to start thinking about, if we want to get to the outcomes that we claim we want to get to, we have to start layering in attention to funding to support for dismantling the institutional and systemic barriers that are keeping us from getting to where we want to get to. So I think that it is, so I don't know what it's hard right now sometimes to see, you know, kind of this bright, shiny future. But what I do know is I'm not going to be able to see a bright, shiny future if I don't keep doing the work that I'm doing.
Yes, yes, like yes, and then writ large close out, like yes to everything. The only thing that I would add is that personally, I have a degree of apprehension about the future, kind of counterbalanced by this burning sense of desiring justice or hope and opportunity, right? And so it's a conflicting feeling that's energizing, but also scary. So, for example, with the most recent financial collapses, you hear top-notch federal political officials blaming woke banking on the collapse
Yes.
of the financial industry. And so it gets to everything that we talked about earlier about it's so comfortable for a system that has always really been inequitable to say like it's because we're trying to level the ship, it's because we're trying to create equal opportunity that we're experiencing difficulty. And it's a false narrative, right? And so you have these overpowering false narratives pushed by a lot of times by people of power and people in decision-making authority. That gives me a degree of apprehension because that ends up influencing a lot of public opinion. And I'm also an AFM studies. I was a double major, Denise. So I was like, let me give a shout out to Black studies. But like we were taught that public opinion equals public policy. And 20 years for me doing this work, there's really a degree of truth of if there's a loud enough voice at the top that influences the masses, regardless of whether the facts are true, you can really end up with a public policy system and systems that reinforce the false narrative. So that's the apprehension
Seen
piece.
that firsthand.
Yes.
Recently, our history
Yes.
without.
Yes. On the flip side, we're not starting this work at a deficit or with no blueprints. Sometimes in this sector, we talk about how it feels like Groundhog Day, because inevitably these same issues and the same grappling comes up over and over again on the policy front. So if I narrow down specifically, like I'll stick on childcare for this purpose, there's a couple of things that can happen. Is one, it has, Lisa said earlier, talking about, standing in your truth, being able to kind of take up space in a room, that has to continue to happen in these arenas where there are policy decisions being made, no matter how uncomfortable it is. And you don't always have to do it yourself. Sometimes it's behind the scenes. You have to call some folks for reinforcement, but we have to continue to tackle these systems of inequity so that we're not perpetuating long-term lack of opportunity among women, but among BIPOC communities as well, and low-income communities. That's one. The second piece of hope that I have is that I am now at a point of middle age, and I see a whole new energy around youth entering this space, and they're energized and they're hungry and they have new thoughts and ideas. And I think that there's a way that our institutions should be capitalizing and growing that and building on it, and also educating it, right? Because you don't know everything, but guess what? I can learn from you too. Let's see whether that's the hopeful part of wanting to galvanize that. In the case of actual systems for childcare in particular, clap, Denise, what you said about the system being chronically underfunded, quite honestly, impossible in terms of a business balance sheet. What providers are doing is working miracles in terms of how they're keeping their doors of operation open. But we also have to be reflective in terms of our own institutions who support the sector to ask, are our systems and processes either intentionally or unintentionally reinforcing the inequitable overlaid system that exists? So why can't childcare providers walk into a traditional financial institution and just say, give me a business loan? Like, we know some of those reasons. Or if you're a family-based provider, why is your home appraising? If you're a BIPOC family-based provider, why is your home appraising for differently? And why can't you get assets to basically make your spaces more welcoming, accommodating, safe, and healthy for the kids that you're caring for? So these are all questions that I think we have a degree of power and authority over in our own spaces to push the needle about how we do business, but also hold ourselves accountable and be honest about, like, are we really trying to make a change in the sector? Or are we just kind of following a talking point that became popular after 3 years of racial upheaval and rioting? So there's an opportunity that exists there as well.
Yes. All right.
We got some truth telling going on today. I'm loving this conversation.
So we talked about the future. We've talked about policy. We've talked about shaping those policies. We've talked about a little bit about housing. We talked a whole lot about systems and the need to change those systems. And we've ended with hope. Although sometimes we don't see the hope, but we somewhat ended with it, Thriving communities. Communities can only thrive if people like the three ladies that are on this screen keep using your voices. And on behalf of the world full of women, particularly BIPOC women, women of color, we thank you, ladies, for showing up for us, being our advocates, being our champions. Your work is not in vain. You have people coming behind you and who are looking at you, whether you know it or not, who are trying to carry the same mantle, hopefully a shorter distance than what y'all had to carry or had to carry. Highly doubt it, but there's hope. But we thank you for being here. We thank you for just what you're doing. Any closing comments that I'll give it to each one of you. Any last thoughts, closing comments, whatever you want to leave the people with. In this Women's History Month, that should be Women's History Year. Just like I say, Black History Month is 365 days, not just in February. Any concluding comments?
Well, I just really appreciate, I feel like I have three new sisters in the fight. And just really appreciate having an opportunity to share a little bit of personal, a little bit of work, a little bit of what we might do together in the future. And I will be in Kansas City and hope to connect with you all in person. But just in terms of a final thought, I mean, I really do think that we have this gift of this unique perspective of our own lived experiences as women of color in this work of community development. And another note of hope, I feel like we have risen up in the field. We are at the heads of foundations. We are leading policy work. We are, embedded in these institutions that are open to changing and transforming. So I feel like we have a lot more synergy and just I think that there is support for work that is thinking about racial equity, that is thinking about doing things different. Particularly, I think we have looked at ourselves in the mirror as housing community development field, and 30 years, in some communities, things are worse, not better. So what do we do about that, right? And so I feel like the field as a whole is primed to try to do things differently. At the same time, while I feel that, the nation and the national policy conversation and what's going on in our political world doesn't seem to be, saying that same message. So perhaps that's the resistance to the power that is being built.
I'm just going to thank Nicole, because you actually helped me end on that hopeful, or conversation on that hopeful note, when you're talking about that next generation of women that we see that are stepping in and doing the work. And as you were talking, I was like, literally the faces of some of those women were just kind of showed up in front of me. And so I think that you're right. Like, that is, there are some phenomenal women that are doing the work. It just reminds me that I need to make sure that I am supporting in ways that are helpful, the work of others, to really impact the lives of people in our community. And I think, there's a joyful purpose to that work. But again, I think maybe because, particularly over the last 3 years, there were some times where I really felt pretty close to broken. That's the other thing that I want to continue. I'm now preaching the gospel of rest is revolution, and so that's the one thing I think we need to make sure that we're also loving and supporting each other, and we're really making sure that we're saying, sis, are you taking good care of yourself? Because we have to take care of to be able to do the work, we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. So what I will say to everybody out there that's listening, that is listening because they care deeply about the work of making our communities more equitable. They care deeply about supporting how that work impacts the lives of women. Care deeply about supporting yourselves and the women that you know that are doing this work.
It's perfect. The only thing that I would say is, again, thank you, Holly, for providing this space, because I think a lot of times the space and time to actually take a breath and reflect and be thoughtful about some of these issues doesn't exist. So I think conversations like this are immensely important. And I have a commitment to actually trying to find ways to actually funnel women and women of color, particularly from the policy side, into the community development field. And there's a way to do that. And so I guess I end on kind of tag teaming with you, Lisa and Denise, about like, I'd be eager to think critically about what that looks like, because there's so much opportunity there. And I think that there's opportunity for engagement, new and fresh ideas, but also reinforcing the ranks. Like, just imagine how powerful institutions would be if you had multiple bodies of the same accord. So again, thank you again for the space to even have this conversation.
Yeah, well, we thank LISC National for allowing us this opportunity, this platform to even have this space. We thank you for showing up for us, ladies. We thank you, audience, for just continuing to have interest in women's issues and just changing the narrative and really creating thriving societies and thriving communities. But we are going to end on a point of hope. And the word with Denise, we're gonna say, sis, take care of you. We love you. We thank you, everybody, and happy Women's Year, 365 days. See ya.